Is everything you've been taught about biblical history a carefully constructed lie? What if I told you that the very foundations of your faith have been deliberately hidden from you for centuries? The truth about the Israelites, their appearance, their journey, their legacy, has been systematically erased from our collective consciousness. But today, we're going to shatter that deception. The identity of the true Israelites isn't just some academic debate. It's about reclaiming a stolen heritage that belongs to millions who have been disconnected from their divine birthright. These 9 shocking secrets I'm about to reveal will fundamentally transform how you understand scripture, history, and perhaps even your own identity. Are you ready to have your entire worldview challenged? Because once you hear these truths, backed by scripture, historical evidence, and even modern science, you cannot unhear them. This information has been deliberately suppressed for generations, but today, the veil is being lifted. Hamet Yidgael Hayam, the truth will be revealed today. The journey we're about to embark on isn't for the faint of heart. It will challenge everything you've been taught in Sunday school, everything you've seen in religious paintings, and everything your pastors may have told you. But if you stay with me until the end, I promise you'll understand why this matters so profoundly to all of God's children, regardless of where you come from. Let's begin with the first shocking secret that the powers that be don't want you to know about the true Israelites of the Bible. The identity of the biblical Israelites has been one of history's most contested subjects. But what if I told you that the evidence pointing to their true identity has been hiding in plain sight all along? The biblical Israelites weren't the pale-skinned, European, featured people we see in most religious artwork and films. The scriptures themselves paint a very different picture. When we examine the Bible without the filter of European artistic interpretation, we find numerous descriptions that clearly indicate the Israelites were a dark-skinned people. In the Song of Solomon 1:3-5-6, the Shulamite woman declares, "I am black, but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me, because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me." This isn't merely describing a tan. The Hebrew word used here is ishacher, meaning black or very dark. But this isn't just about skin color. It's about a deliberate campaign to disconnect certain peoples from their biblical heritage. When Moses fled Egypt, he was mistaken for an Egyptian by the daughters of the priest of Midian in Exodus 2:19. How could this be possible unless Moses physically resembled the Egyptians, who ancient wall paintings clearly depict as dark-skinned people? Even more telling is the description of the depraved Jeremiah's people in Lamentations 4:8, where it states, "Their visage is blacker than a coal." And in Lamentations 5:10, "Our skin was black like an oven." These aren't metaphorical statements but descriptions of a people who bore the physical characteristics of those indigenous to northeastern Africa. Ani Mammon Bamuna Shlema, I believe with perfect faith that the Bible itself testifies to the true appearance of the Israelites. But this truth has been systematically buried, whitewashed, and rewritten to serve a narrative that disconnected millions from their spiritual birthright. The first secret reveals itself in the curse of Deuteronomy 28, which prophesied exactly what would happen to the children of Israel if they disobeyed God's commandments. This chapter describes in haunting detail the future enslavement and scattering of the Israelites. Verse 68 specifically states, "And the Lord shall bring thee to Egypt again with ships." This wasn't literal Egypt, but symbolized bondage and slavery, which people in history were taken into bondage on ships, sold as slaves, and scattered throughout the world exactly as Deuteronomy described. The transatlantic slave trade perfectly fulfills this prophecy. Millions were taken from Africa's west coast, transported on ships, and sold into slavery, just as the Bible predicted would happen to the Israelites. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. The Hebrew word, Cush, often translated as Ethiopia in English Bibles, actually referred to a much larger region of Africa. The biblical Cushites were black Africans, and the Bible repeatedly connects them to the Israelite lineage. Moses himself married a Cushite woman according to Numbers 12:1, and Miriam was punished for criticizing this union, not because of the woman's nationality, but because of her prejudice. Zipporah, lo na lach lodeber catch. Zipporah, it is not becoming for you to speak this way. God's rebuke of Miriam shows that he had no issue with intermarriage between Israelites and Cushites, suggesting a close relationship between these peoples. The second shocking secret concerns the true origins of the Israelite patriarchs themselves. Abraham, the father of the Israelite nation, came from Ur of the Chaldees in Mesopotamia. This region was a melting pot of various peoples, including those from the African continent. The Bible never describes Abraham's physical appearance, leaving room for centuries of European artistic interpretation to reimagine him as European. But consider this: Abraham's grandson Jacob had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. One of these sons, Joseph, was sold into slavery in Egypt, where he rose to prominence. When his brothers came to Egypt during the famine, they didn't recognize him because he was dressed as an Egyptian, according to Genesis 42. But would merely changing clothes make someone recognizable to their own brothers? Or is it more likely that Joseph physically resembled the Egyptians enough that, when dressed as one, his brothers couldn't distinguish him? The ancient Egyptians left us countless depictions themselves in their artwork and tomb paintings. These consistently show a people with dark skin, full lips, and other features associated with northeastern African peoples today. If Joseph could blend in among them, what does that tell us about the appearance of the Israelites? Hamitzrim Hadim Akim Heyu. The Egyptians and Hebrews were brothers. This connection runs deeper than most biblical scholars are willing to admit. The third secret that's been hidden concerns the linguistic connections between Hebrew and various African languages. Hebrew belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, which includes many African languages such as Amharic, spoken by Ethiopian Jews, and various Berber languages of North Africa. Researchers have discovered striking similarities between Hebrew and certain West African languages, particularly in religious terminology. The Yoruba people of Nigeria, for example, have traditions and linguistic elements that bear remarkable resemblance to ancient Hebrew practices. Their word for Saturday, Ojo Simi, echoes the Hebrew concept of Shabbat. The Ejbo people of Nigeria practice male circumcision on the 8th day, just as prescribed in Hebrew law, and maintain other traditions that mirror ancient Israelite customs. These aren't coincidences. They're linguistic fossils, evidence of a connection that has been deliberately obscured. When we examine these languages without the bias of Eurocentric scholarship, the connections become undeniable. Safa Achat Lakolanu. We all shared one language once. The dispersion of the Israelites took their language with them, leaving traces throughout Africa that scholars are only now beginning to acknowledge. But why would such connections be buried? Why would there be such resistance to acknowledging the African origins of the Israelites? The answer lies in the fourth secret, the deliberate camp to rewrite biblical history during the colonial era. European powers needed biblical justification for the slave trade and colonization. If the enslaved Africans were recognized as the descendants of the biblical Israelites, how could their enslavement and subjugation be justified? It became necessary to create a narrative that disconnected Africa from biblical history, reimagining the Israelites as proto-Europeans rather than the northeastern African people they actually were. This wasn't just artistic license, it was a calculated theological position that Libra served colonial interests. By the 19th century, this revisionist history had become so entrenched that questioning it was considered heretical. The images of a white Jesus, white disciples, and white biblical figures became standard, despite the geographic and historical impossibility of such depictions. But the truth couldn't be completely erased. It survived in ancient texts, in archaeological evidence, and in the cultural memory of peoples throughout Africa and the diaspora. And now, this buried truth is resurfacing with undeniable force. The fifth secret concerns the ancient maps and historical documents that place Israelite communities throughout Africa long before European contact. Medieval maps from Arab geographers show Hebrew kingdoms in West Africa. Portuguese explorers in the 15th and 16th centuries documented meeting people throughout Africa who practiced forms of Judaism and identified as descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. These weren't isolated communities. They were organized societies with established traditions, religious practices, and oral histories tracing their lineage back to ancient Israel. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia maintained their Aish identity for centuries, preserving ancient texts and practices that sometimes predated rabbinical Judaism. Their existence alone challenges the narrative that the Israelites were exclusively a Middle Eastern or European people. Lo tishkach et hevat shelcha, do not forget your ancestors. This commandment to remember has kept these communities connected to their Israelite heritage, despite centuries of pressure to abandon it. The sixth secret involves the archaeological evidence that has been systematically ignored or misinterpreted. Artifacts bearing Hebrew inscriptions have been discovered throughout Africa, from Egypt to Mali to South Africa. Stone tablets with ancient Hebrew writing have been found in Zimbabwe. Gold artifacts with Hebrew inscriptions have been unearthed in West Africa. In 1999, archaeologists discovered the ruins of what appears to be an ancient synagogue in Nata Playa, in southern Egypt, dating back thousands of years. Yet these findings rarely make it into mainstream archaeological journals or biblical histories. When they are mentioned, they're often dismissed as anomalies or misidentifications, rather than evidence of a widespread Israelite presence in Africa. Why this resistance? Because acknowledging this evidence would require rewriting centuries of biblical scholarship and challenging deeply entrenched theological positions that have served particular political and social agendas. Hamet Hibatok Haudama. The truth is in the ground. No matter how many layers of deception are piled on top, the archaeological evidence eventually emerges. The seventh secret concerns the spiritual practices and traditions that connect ancient Israelite worship to African religious customs. Many African spiritual traditions include elements that mirror Levitical practices, animal sacrifice, purification rituals, dietary restrictions similar to kosher laws, and even the use of prayer shawls and head coverings. The Lemba people of South Africa maintain traditions strikingly similar to ancient Israelite practices, including dietary restrictions, male circumcision, and Sabbath observance. DNA testing has confirmed that Lemba men carry the Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic marker associated with the Jewish priesthood. This scientific evidence supports their oral tradition claiming descent from ancient Israelite priests. Similarly, the Sefwi tribe in Ghana practiced a form of Judaism for centuries before making contact with the wider Jewish world. Their traditions included Sabbath observance, biblical dietary laws, and festivals that align with the Hebrew calendar. These weren't practices adopted from European missionaries. They predated European contact. Minhajim, Shelavatinu, Biadainu, the customs of our fathers are in our hands. These traditions weren't borrowed or adopted. They were preserved through generations as part of an unbroken cultural inheritance. The eighth shocking secret involves the deliberate suppression of texts and historical documents that would have revealed these connections. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE and subsequent church decisions about which texts would be included in the biblical canon. Many texts that emphasized the African connections of early Christianity and Judaism were excluded. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains a biblical canon that includes books not found in Western Bibles, such as the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. These texts provide additional context about the appearance and origins of biblical figures that often contradicts European depictions. Is it mere coincidence that these texts were excluded from the Western canon? Even within the accepted biblical texts, passages that clearly indicate the African appearance of biblical figures have been mistranslated or reinterpreted to obscure their meaning. The description of Christ in Revelation 1:14-15 describes him with hair, like wool, and feet, like burnished bronze. Features consistent with African peoples rather than Europeans. Yet artistic depictions consistently ignore these descriptions. Sefarim Nignezu, Avol Hamet Lo, books may be hidden, but truth cannot be. Despite these efforts at suppression, the evidence continues to surface. The ninth and perhaps most shocking secret concerns the prophecies about the regathering of the scattered Israelites in the last days. According to Isaiah 11:12, the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. This prophecy speaks of a time when the scattered Israelites would rediscover their identity and return to their heritage. We are witnessing this prophecy unfold as people throughout the African diaspora reconnect with their Israeli roots. This isn't a new religion or a modern invention, it's the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Jeremiah 16:19 declares, "The Gentiles shall come unto thee from the ends of the earth, and shall say, Surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit." This verse prophesies a time when people would realize they had been taught falsehoods about their spiritual heritage. Exactly what's happening today as more people discover the truth about the Israelites' identity. Hayim and Bayim, behold, the days are coming. The prophesied awakening is happening before our eyes, yet many religious leaders continue to resist or dismiss it. Now let's address the historical clues that have been deliberately overlooked. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE, Where did the surviving Israelites flee? Historical records and archaeological evidence show that many fled into Africa, joining existing Israelite communities there. The Jewish diaspora in North Africa wasn't just a result of later migrations from Europe. It was directly connected to the original dispersion from Jerusalem. Roman historians like Tacitus describe the Jews as resembling Egyptians and Ethiopians more than Europeans. Josephus, the Jewish historian, never describes his people as white or European in appearance. These historical accounts have been conveniently ignored in favor of a Europeanized narrative of biblical history. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, contains early Christian texts that present a very different picture of early Christianity than the one promoted by European theologians. These texts emphasize connections to Egyptian and Ethiopian traditions and present Jesus and his disciples in a way that reflects their Middle Eastern and African context, rather than the European reimagining that came centuries later. Lo tister et hair, do not hide the light. These historical documents shine a light on truths that have been deliberately obscured. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia represent one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the African ancient Israelites. For centuries, they maintained Jewish traditions in complete isolation from European Jewish communities. Their practices sometimes differ from rabbinical Judaism because they preserved older forms of worship that predated the destruction of the Second Temple. In 1985, Israel airlifted thousands of Ethiopian Jews to Israel during Operation Moses, recognizing them as legitimate descendants of ancient Israel. This official recognition contradicts the narrative that the Israelites were exclusively a light-skinned people. The Beta Israel maintained their Israelite identity despite centuries of pressure to convert to Christianity, preserving ancient texts and traditions that connect directly to biblical Israel. Ethiopia tiftat yedehal Elohim. Ethiopia shall stretch out her hands to God. This prophecy from Psalm 68:31 has been fulfilled through the preservation of Israelite faith among the Beta Israel. But the evidence extends far beyond Ethiopia. The transatlantic slave trade didn't just represent a human tragedy of immense proportions, it fulfilled biblical prophecy about the scattering of the Israelites. Deuteronomy 28:68 specifically mentions Israelites being transported on ships to be sold as slaves, with no one to buy you, meaning no one to redeem or rescue them. This prophecy was fulfilled with chilling accuracy during the slave trade. The spiritual resilience of enslaved Africans in the Americas often reflected their connection to Israelite traditions. Their spirituals frequently referenced the exodus from Egypt, seeing their own experience as a parallel to ancient Israel's bondage. This wasn't simply adopting biblical stories, it was recognizing their own place within that continuing narrative. Avadim Hainu, Atab Nai Koran, we were slaves, now we are free people. This Passover declaration took on profound meaning for those who recognized their place in the ongoing Israelite story. Archaeological discoveries continue to challenge the Europeanized biblical narrative. In 2012, archaeologists in Israel discovered a 2,000-year-old synagogue with mosaics depicting biblical scenes. The figures in these mosaics have distinctly African features, with dark skin and curly hair. Similar mosaics have been found throughout the Middle East, showing biblical figures with features that more closely resemble modern northeastern Africans than Europeans. In the ancient city of Dura, Europos in modern Syria, wall paintings from a 3rd century synagogue show biblical figures with dark skin. These aren't isolated examples, but part of a consistent pattern of representation that was later erased and replaced with European imagery. Hapsipha's Medaber Emet, the mosaic speaks truth. These ancient artworks provide visual evidence that contradicts centuries of European artistic reimagining. The linguistic evidence extends beyond similarities between Hebrew and African languages. Many names and terms in the Bible have meanings in African languages that reveal deeper connections. The name Moses, for example, comes from Egyptian mes, or mizu, meaning child or son. The term Kohen, designating the priestly class, has cognates in several African languages referring to spiritual leaders or holy persons. These linguistic connections aren't coincidental. They reflect the deep cultural and genetic ties between the ancient Israelites and African peoples. When we examine biblical Hebrew without European linguistic biases, its connections to African language families become undeniable. Malimhen Makem Lo Zikaron, words are a place for memory. The shared linguistic heritage preserves connections that historical revisionists tried to erase. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from modern genetic studies. DNA analysis of various populations claiming Israelite heritage has revealed fascinating connections. Studies of Y chromosomal DNA among certain West African populations, including the Lemban groups in Cameroon and Nigeria, have identified genetic markers associated with the ancient Israelite priesthood. A 2012 study published in the journal Nature found genetic links between Ethiopian Jews and Middle Eastern populations that date back approximately 3,000 years, precisely when the Bible describes interactions between Israel and the Kingdom of Sheba. This scientific evidence supports the historical claims of these communities rather than dismissing them as myths or later adoptions. A DNA I know Mishaker, DNA doesn't lie. Modern science is confirming what these communities have maintained through oral tradition for centuries. The cultural practices that connect African traditions to ancient Israel go beyond religious rituals. Many African naming ceremonies, coming-of-age rituals, and funeral practices bear striking similarities to those described in the Torah. The practice of levirate marriage, where a man marries his deceased brother's widow, is found both in the Bible and in numerous African cultures. These aren't practices adopted from Christian missionaries. They often predate European contact, and sometimes preserve biblical traditions more faithfully than Western religious practices. They represent an unbroken culture in inheritance rather than borrowed customs. Minhajim him edut customs are testimony. These preserved practices speak to connections that transcend colonial disruptions. Now let's address some of the controversies and objections that inevitably arise when discussing this topic. Critics often claim that the Black Israelite perspective lacks scholarly support. But this ignores the growing body of academic work from archaeologists, linguists, geneticists, and historians that supports many aspects of this understanding. Scholars like Dr. Ephraim Az of Harvard University, Dr. Tudor Parfit of Florida International University, and Dr. Yosef Ben Jochanan have produced extensive academic work documenting the African connections to ancient Israel. Their research isn't fringe or unscholarly. It represents serious academic inquiry that has been marginalized because it challenges entrenched narratives. Al tivtach bi kachamim levid. Don't trust in scholars alone. The evidence speaks for itself when examined without preconceived biases. Others object that focusing on the racial identity of biblical figures is divisive or unimportant. But this misses the profound spiritual and psychological impact of representation. When people see themselves in sacred history, it creates a deeper connection to faith traditions. The deliberate whitewashing of biblical history hasn't been neutral. It has served to disconnect millions from their spiritual heritage. Moreover, the Bible itself frequently mentions physical descriptions and lineages. If these details weren't important, why would Scripture record them? The Bible traces genealogies in meticulous detail precisely because heritage and identity matter in God's redemptive plan. Kolani mishpacha akat. We are all one family. Recognizing the true diversity of biblical history doesn't divide us. It unites us in a more accurate understanding of our shared spiritual heritage. Some traditionalists push back against these revelations because they challenge centuries of established teaching. But we must ask, established by whom, and for what purpose? Much of what we consider traditional biblical interpretation was established during the colonial era, when theological positions were often shaped by political necessities rather than historical accuracy. True faith requires a willingness to follow truth wherever it leads, even when it challenges comfortable assumptions. As Jesus himself said in John 8:32, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Clinging to historically inaccurate traditions doesn't honor Scripture. It dishonors the God of truth. Emet miretz titzmak, truth springs from the earth. As archaeological and genetic evidence continues to emerge, the truth becomes increasingly difficult to deny. It's important to emphasize that recognizing the African origins of the Israelites doesn't exclude anyone from God's family. The biblical narrative has always included provisions for people all nations to join the covenant community. Ruth the Moabite became an ancestor of King David and Jesus himself. The Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 represents the early spread of Christianity to Africa. God's plan has always been to create a new man from diverse peoples, as Ephesians 2:15 describes. Acknowledging historical truth about the Israelites' identity doesn't create division. It heals the divisions created by centuries of historical revisionism and allows for a more authentic unity based on truth rather than convenient fictions. Enod Milvado, there is none beside him. God transcends our human categories while working through the specific historical realities he ordained. So why have these 9 shocking secrets been hidden for so long? The answer involves power control and the theological justifications for colonialism and slavery. If the enslaved Africans in the Americas were recognized as the descendants of biblical Israel, how could their enslavement be justified? If African peoples were acknowledged as central to biblical history, how could European dominance be presented as divinely ordained? The curse of Ham narrative was developed and promoted to justify African enslavement, despite the fact that the Bible never mentions Ham being cursed. It was Canaan and never associates with skin color. This deliberate misreading of Scripture served political and economic interests rather than biblical truth. Similarly, the doctrine of discovery issued by Pope Nicholas in 1452 gave Christian European powers religious justification for colonizing discovered lands and subjugating non-Christian peoples. These theological positions required reimagining biblical history in a way that centered Europeans and marginalized others. Hashikar in lo raglayim, falsehood has no legs. These theological distortions cannot stand up to honest scriptural examination. The media continues this pattern of erasure and misrepresentation. Biblical films consistently cast European actors to play Middle Eastern and African biblical figures. Educational materials present a Europeanized version of biblical history that ignores archaeological and historical evidence. Even religious artwork in churches and Bibles perpetuates historically inaccurate depictions that serve to disconnect certain peoples from their spiritual heritage. This isn't merely an aesthetic choice. It's the continuation of a deliberate campaign to control the narrative of biblical history. When people don't see themselves in sacred history, they're more easily convinced that they're outsiders to the covenant, rather than central to God's redemptive plan. Inaim lahim vulo yiru. They have eyes but do not see. The evidence has been available, but institutional blindness has prevented many from acknowledging it. But despite these efforts at suppression, a remarkable awakening is occurring. People throughout the African diaspora are rediscovering their connection to the biblical narrative. This isn't about excluding others, it's about reclaiming a heritage that was deliberately obscured. It's about healing the spiritual wounds inflicted by centuries of misrepresentation and disconnection. Isaiah 11 prophesies that God would recover the remnant of his people a second time, gathering them from the nations where they were scattered. We are witnessing this prophecy unfold. People reconnect with their Israelite heritage and identity. This isn't a political movement or a modern invention, it's the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Hinayani Oza Kadasha, behold, I am doing a new thing. God's restoration of truth and identity was foretold in Scripture itself. This awakening isn't just significant for those rediscovering their heritage. It's important for all who value biblical truth. When we base our understanding of Scripture on historical accuracy, rather than colonial reimaginings, we all benefit from a more authentic connection to the text. We all gain a more accurate understanding of God's work in human history. The Bible has always been a story of God's work among diverse peoples. From the mixed multitude that left Egypt with the Israelites to the every nation, tribe, people and language described in Revelation 7:9, Scripture presents a vision of unity that embraces rather than erases diversity. Acknowledging the African origins of the Israelites doesn't diminish anyone's place in this story. It enriches our collective understanding of God's redemptive work. Achta bitach, shonat, you within diversity. This has always been God's design for humanity. So what does this mean for believers today? It means approaching Scripture with fresh eyes, willing to let the text speak for itself, rather than imposing preconceived notions. It means examining the archaeological, linguistic, and genetic evidence without the filter of colonial biases. It means being willing to acknowledge where traditional interpretations have been shaped more by political necessity than historical accuracy. For those who have felt disconnected from biblical history because they didn't see themselves represented, these revelations offer a profound homecoming. The Bible isn't someone else's story that you've been invited into. It's your story, your heritage, your spiritual birthright. Ludovador. From generation to generation. The truth of your heritage has been preserved despite all efforts to erase it. For those who have inherited European interpretations of Scripture, these revelations offer an opportunity for a more authentic faith, based on historical truth, rather than comfortable fictions. Embracing the diversity of biblical history doesn't diminish your place in God's family. It enriches your understanding of the God who works through all peoples and cultures. The awakening happening today isn't a threat to faith, but a fulfillment of prophecy. Jeremiah 16:21 describes a time when nations would come from the ends of the earth saying, "Surely our fathers have inherited lies." This prophecy is being fulfilled as people recognize the historical distortions that have shaped religious understanding and return to a more authentic engagement with Scripture. Hamet Tegel Abayamim Hacharonim, truth will be revealed in the latter days. We are witnessing this prophesied revelation of truth. The evidence we've examined, from biblical texts to archaeology, from linguistics to genetics, from historical documents to preserved cultural practices, forms an overwhelming case for the African origins of the biblical Israelites. This isn't a fringe theory or a modern political position. It's what the evidence consistently indicates, when examined without the bias of colonial interpretations. The resistance to these relations reveals more about the power structures that benefit from the status quo than about the strength of the evidence. When theological positions have been used to justify conquest, enslavement, and oppression, there will inevitably be strong resistance to historical truths that undermine those positions. Mek mirich terbe, the tzedek mishamayim nishkaf. Truth springs from the earth, and righteousness looks down from heaven. As Psalm 8:5-11 declares, truth and righteousness work together in God's redemptive plan. As we conclude this exploration of the 9 shocking secrets about the Black Israelites that have been hidden for centuries, I want to emphasize that this journey isn't about division but reconciliation. Reconciliation with historical truth, with authentic faith, and with one another as members of God's diverse family. The Bible has always been a story of God's work to restore what was broken, to recover what was lost, and to reveal what was hidden. The rediscovery of the Israelites' true identity is part of this ongoing divine work of restoration. It's not a threat to faith, but a fulfillment of prophecy. Isaiah 40:39 declares, "Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare, before they spring forth I tell you of them." God has always been in the business of revealing hidden truths, in His perfect timing. What we're witnessing today is part of that divine revelation. Her Zarwa Latzadik, light is sound for the righteous. The illumination of historical truth brings healing and restoration to all who embrace it. I invite you to continue this journey of discovery. Examine the evidence for yourself. Study the biblical texts without the filter of European artistic interpretations. Look at the archaeological findings, the genetic studies, the linguistic connections. Most importantly, be willing to follow truth wherever it leads, even when it challenges comfortable assumptions. Share this video with others who are seeking a more authentic understanding of biblical history. Leave a comment with your thoughts or questions. If you've experienced a personal awakening to these truths, share your story. We're all part of this unfolding revelation of truth that was prophesied millennia ago. Kulanu mishpacha achet tachet Elohim echet. We are all one family under one God. The truth doesn't divide us. It unites us in a more authentic understanding of our shared spiritual heritage. Thank you for joining me on this journey of discovery. May the God of truth continue to guide you as you seek a deeper understanding of His Word and His work in human history. Until next time, Shalom Aleichem, peace be upon you.